Taylor. I am a recent PhD graduate from University of North Texas in their Performing Arts Health Research program. And I'm also a musician researcher who's really focused on the intersection between health and learning and performing music. One of my special interests is hearing health, so I'm really excited to be here today to discuss that with you. As part of my hearing health journey, I've done some work with the World Health Organization on their Make Listening Safe initiative, and also been involved with the Certified Hearing Occupational Therapist or Hearing Occupational Conservationist program in the United States. So I'm really excited to share with you what you need to know to keep your ears healthy as a clarinetist. All right, if you want to grab this QR code, this is just going to have the presentation up close for you. This is the first link, and then there's also some other links to just various resources on my website. Feel free to grab that. And while you're pulling that up, I just wanted to start off today with a quote from Chris Martin, who's from Coldplay, the band, and he suffers from tinnitus and noise-induced hearing loss after years of performing. And he had this to say about his hearing health. Give you another second here. All right, so he had this to say about his hearing health. Looking after your ears is unfortunately something you don't think about until there's a problem. I wish I'd thought about it earlier. Hearing is so important to our craft as musicians, but it's often something we take for granted. So the big question here is, what is a healthy ear versus a damaged ear? This will help us to better understand noise-induced hearing loss and how we can prevent it in the future. So just to reorient us to kind of the functions and the anatomy of the ear just a little bit. The ear has three main parts. So the outer, which is the pin of that part that you can see on the outside, and then also the ear canal, which is this little channel here. And fun fact, the ear canal is actually slightly S-shaped, which I didn't know until I started working in hearing conservation. So that's one of the things we'll do when we put in our earplugs is actually straighten our ear canal, which I'll teach you how to do. And then it leads into the eardrum, which is the start of the middle ear. We've got three bones in the middle ear that work to translate acoustical energy into mechanical energy. So the three bones in the middle ear take the acoustical energy, translate it into mechanical energy, which is then put into the cochlea, which is this little snail-shaped part of our ear, snail-shaped organ that's full of those little hair cells. And those hair cells are all frequency specific. And so that's how our brain starts to interpret sound as, in our case, music, but also whatever you're listening to. So kind of a complex chain of events that are happening for us to be able to hear. And unfortunately, or fortunately, these hair cells are frequency specific. So that also means when they become damaged, you're not able to perceive sounds as well or as easily in those frequencies, and sometimes not at all. Because this cochlea is also snail-shaped, remember, the high-frequency cells are sort of near the entrance of the cochlea, and then the more low-frequency sounds are perceived more towards the middle spiral of the cochlea. And this is why it's most often the high-frequency sounds are what we lose first in our hearing. And again, once this damage happens, it's unfortunately something we can't repair. For high-frequency sound loss, you may experience things like losing clarity of speech. It's sort of like a first sign. You're not able to hear like S's, T's, or Z's as clearly anymore. And this can be what we characterize as noise-induced hearing loss. We'll talk a little bit more about that here on the next slide. So an audiogram is how an audiologist or an ENT would measure a person's hearing to help start to identify if they're showing signs of hearing loss. This graph here, this square line represents normal hearing, and then this dotted line with the circles represents a person who may be experiencing hearing loss. This in particular area is a V or a U-shaped section of this audiogram that's showing us the poorest hearing is in this higher frequency range. So on this graph we have frequency on the top and then intensity or loudness of sound on the bottom. So essentially they're not able to hear 4,000 hertz until the sound is 50 dB versus 1,000 hertz, they're able to hear it when the sound is only around like 15 dB. Does that sort of make sense to everyone? Okay, perfect. So different patterns of noise-induced hearing loss can exist, but this is just sort of the most common one that we see. So to give you an idea of what an audiogram is like, we're going to go into just a little demonstration here. So we're going to do the same thing twice. The first time we're going to do this, it will be with our eyes closed. And I'm going to start this sound. I'm going to turn my computer volume all the way down. And I want you to listen for the sound. And when you think you're hearing the sound, go ahead and raise your hand. This is a 4,000 hertz tone. So feel free to close your eyes for now if you feel comfortable. And then I'm going to start the sound momentarily. Okay. Great. All right, awesome. We've all found the sound. Okay, now we'll do the same thing again with our eyes closed. Or with your eyes open, sorry. Okay, ready? Yeah, so see, we all sort of have different perceptions of when we can finally hear that 4,000 hertz tone. And that's okay. This is something that you would do in an audiogram. They would play a series of tones at different frequency levels and give you an idea of where your hearing is on that graph. So really not an invasive procedure by any means, but something that is important for musicians, and we'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end. All right. So how many people does this noise-induced hearing loss or hearing loss in general impact worldwide? So I'd love some responses from the room here. How many people are impacted by hearing loss worldwide, do you think, globally? How many people? 30%. 30%, yeah? A lot, yeah. Come on in. Yeah, so some recent meta-analyses have found that actually 1.57 billion people are impacted, and this is about 20% of the global population. And this is specifically 5% of the global population is impacted by noise-induced hearing loss itself. So hearing loss is due to external factors typically. We can also, they also found that hearing loss is a little bit more common in adult men than other parts of the population. And if we break this down a little bit more specifically, looking at musicians, we can see that a 2015 study by University or Healthy Musicians UK, they aim to understand musicians' hearing problems and their hearing health related behavior. And so the researchers asked 693 participants to self-report whether they felt they had hearing loss. And you'll see that 40% of them said, yes, I have hearing loss. There were also more commonly older musicians that had hearing loss. People who played in band had more hearing loss than people who didn't. And then, fortunately for us clarinet players, we found that woodwinds had a slightly lower incidence rate of hearing loss compared to the other populations, but this wasn't something that the researchers found to be extremely significant. They also asked the participants to tell me what sort of hearing problem you're experiencing. So the first one they said was tinnitus, so that's like ringing in the ears. How many of us have experienced tinnitus at some point or the other? Probably everyone in this room. And hearing loss in one ear was a symptom. Hearing loss in both ears was the next highest. And then hypercasis is the fourth highest. This is if you're in a restaurant and you're having a hard time hearing the person across from you because the external sound is so loud. That can be a symptom of sensitivity to external noise. That's a symptom of hypercasis. And then dysplacus is actually pitch perception differences between ears. So you would hear, like, say, a B flat in this ear, and then this ear you're maybe perceiving it as a different pitch. So as you can see, all of these hearing problems can be real challenges for us as musicians trying to perform or learn our craft in the way that suits us best. You can also see on this graph sort of what clarinetists or woodwind players are most dealing with, and it's similar to the main graph over here. Tinnitus, hearing loss in one ear, both ears, hypercasis, and then also sensitivity and pain was another complaint that was put on this graph. So this brings us to how do we know when something is risky? The decibel scale is how we measure intensity of sound in our scientific world of hearing health. And so the intensity of sound is measured using the decibel scale. There's lots of examples on here. A refrigerator is going to run you about 40 dB, hair dryer about 90, a trombone, although this is a picture of a tuba. I didn't make this, but they said, a tuba can max out around 110. So just to give you an idea of the intensity or loudness of sound happening in your daily environment. And one of the misconceptions that I often hear from musicians is that anything over 85 dB is bad for your hearing. 85 decibel cutoff is actually from, in the United States, NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and they're recommended exposure limits. And these limits are really designed for employees and workers in the factory setting who are exposed to broadband steady state noise over an 8-hour period for up to 40 hours a week for up to a 40-year work life. And their guidelines are also to move further away from the sound source, reduce the time you're exposed to sounds, and then also use hearing protection to attenuate or block sound from entering the ear. There's been a lot of attempts to apply these constructs to music, but there's actually some differences here between factory noise and music and performance venues and a factory setting. And so what I'd like to do next is have you think about these two differences. So between our performance venue here and our factory venue, and I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. What are some differences in the venues itself versus the factory settings itself? And then if you'll turn to your neighbors and just kind of discuss, pick a couple of things to talk about. What are the differences you see between a performance venue and a factory setting?
Performance venue is more likely to have acoustical incorporation into the design to help the audience. A band shell behind the performers to project the sound. I don't know how.
Enhance hearing. Yeah. You can hear each other, you can hear yourself, the audience can hear you.
We can also think about,
To a lot of sound on stage.
we'll take a small pause here. And also think about the difference between factory workers and musicians and the behaviors they might be doing in these spaces. So talk about those things as well as what you're already discussing. And we'll come back as a group in just a second. Maybe a question is, who's more likely to wear hearing protection in these settings?
Factory worker.
Factory workers have a better hearing.
Could be. Yeah. Who's the one doing the sound making in this setting?
Musicians.
Musicians are. Factory workers aren't doing the sound. They're just turning a button.
If they're operating a machine shop or something, they could be generating sound.
They could be. But still the machine is the thing that's making the sound, not the musician. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we'll give you about 10 more seconds here.
Can't move away from the source when you're the source.
Yeah, great points. Okay, we'll bring it back in. I'd love to hear a couple responses from your groups. Did this exercise bring up anything that was interesting to you or anything surprising?
Well, one was about the earplugs. You know, factory workers are required to wear the earplugs.
Yeah.
We are, I mean, we do. We have an issue with it. You know, it's detrimental to what we're trying to do.
Yeah, yeah. And most musicians find them really uncomfortable. They're hard to play with. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
One of the difference is that with a musician in a concert hall, the volume is the amplitude is not always constant. Like sometimes it's very quiet, even when it's 200 piece orchestra.
Yes.
But with the factory, the amplitude is pretty constant because of the consistent running of the machine.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say there is no variety as in the Mahler symphony.
Yeah.
It's just honestly fortissimo all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Great point. Any others? One more, maybe. Yeah. I think you two in the front had a good point about who's driving the sound here, if you want to maybe say that.
Well, musicians on a soundstage are generating sound.
Yeah.
And depending on the type of factory work being done, the workers themselves may not themselves be initiating a sound, but they could be operating equipment that could be generating high volume of sound.
Absolutely, absolutely. All super great points. So just to recap a little of our discussion here. So factory noise is the same intensity of sound or loudness of the sound throughout an entire shift that a worker is doing, and usually that's about 8 hours. While in music, we really want to hear a full spectrum of pitches and intensities or dynamics, and this helps us actually create the best music possible, right? Our musical behaviors are what is driving the sound and also driving our risk. We can decide how long we're practicing for. We can decide how long we're practicing our most intense or most loud parts versus our most soft parts. We can also decide this as a conductor during a rehearsal setting. We also want to be in a performance venue. We want to be listening to music. I don't know about you, but I'd way rather listen to music versus factory noise. And this is really why it's crucial for us as musicians to understand the sound exposure happening in a space and recognize that musicians, ensemble directors, administrators, and others should take ownership of musical behaviors in these spaces to help manage risks for everyone involved. This is also why NIOSH themselves has stated that these standards may not be applicable to music because of the difference between music settings and factory noise settings. So in 2022, the World Health Organization started working on this problem where we have these standards that work for factory noise, but we don't really have anything for music, which I think you sort of alluded to here. While these recommendations aren't fully developed and fully implemented, these guidelines can help us to sort of move in a step in the right direction. So these guidelines say that music venues should not exceed 100 dB LEQ, which is just an average of 100 decibels over any 15-minute period throughout a musical event or performance event. This is essentially a moving window throughout a concert in which the venue must turn down the volume if the event exceeds 100 decibels in that 15-minute period. These limits focus on reducing unnecessarily loud sounds, especially during amplified music. And in most venues, the soundboard operator is the person that's typically going to be in charge of that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And also, sorry, didn't interrupt. I was actually up there, I'm actually taking care of this clip right now. I was actually already up there, sorry. I could hear only a dozen people's applauses, was almost sound like half the hall was going on, the backstage.
Wow. Yeah, yeah, really intense. These standards are sort of opt-in at this point, so there's venues. In Europe, there's a lot of venues that are taking up these standards. In the US, not so much. So really, eventually, the goal is to have these limits be something that we can find in settings ranging from, your Taylor Swift concert to your local pop punk shows in venues down the street from your house. While not a perfect assessment, these recommendations, along with those NIOSH, can sort of give us a framework to work from to help us start to manage our risk. So the big question here, how do musicians prevent noise-induced hearing loss? The first thing that musicians should do is to schedule an annual audiogram. This is going to be the best way to know if you are starting to move down the path toward hearing loss. You can take steps to prevent it. And while most recommendations say that you don't need an annual audiogram until about 60, musicians we know are exposed to more sounds than the normal population. So having an annual audiogram as soon as you can is a great way to get a baseline. And as I mentioned earlier, audiograms are typically done by an audiologist or an ENT, depending on your country that you're from. The other thing we can do as musicians is to remember that your sound exposure is cumulative. So we know that our individual practice as a musician is also cumulative. So much like that, sound exposure throughout your entire day is cumulative. So be mindful about your exposure to sounds before and after time with your instrument to give your ears adequate time to rest. This might mean limiting what you listen to on the way to and from your rehearsals or your lessons, or choosing to sit in the patio of a restaurant where maybe it's a little quieter than sitting inside where there's a lot of amplified sound coming through the speakers along with background noise. During your practice time, you can also switch up playing at different dynamic levels to ensure there's plenty of variance in the sound. Same thing with frequency levels. If you're practicing a whole lot of altissimo at one session, maybe take a little break and switch to something that's a little bit lower register on the clarinet. These are also just good practice habits anyway, which is really nice for us. Another thing that musicians can do is start to monitor sound levels in your environment. So this is one app that I like. This link is for the Apple App Store for the NIOSH Sound Level Meter app. If you'd like to download it, feel free. It's also in the slides that are on the QR code I put up at the very beginning. But this tool is going to help you measure exposure during events. So you basically turn it on like you would any recording a device, and it's going to give you some statistics here as far as what's happening in the sound. Really, the two that I'd love for you to consider are your TWA, or time-weighted average, which is going to be the average decibel level you've been exposed to since you pressed record on this device, and your dose. And this dose is essentially how close you're getting to exceeding what is the equivalent of 85 dB in an 8-hour period over a 40-year work life, or 40-hour-a-week work week for a 40-year work life. So those are the two statistics you want to see. And I have a measurement up here. This is from a concert that I attended in 2022, and I only recorded about an hour of the concert. So we'll look a little bit at the statistics here. This is 88.4 dB time-weighted average, so I was over that 85 dB limit. And I was also experiencing 217% dose in that 1 hour period. So a lot of dose. Don't worry, I was wearing earplugs for this. So when you see these sorts of numbers coming up on your noise dosimeter, you can start to take steps to limit your risk. So what does that look like for us? Well, in these sorts of settings, I would definitely recommend wearing an earplug. So this brings us to our earplug demonstration here. So we are going to take our earplugs, if you want to grab them. If you didn't get them, I've got a couple more pairs here. And go ahead and open the packages. And you'll pull out one of the foam and one of the silicone earplugs. Did anyone not get earplugs? Yeah. Anyone else need them? Okay. Yeah. Do you want some?
I'm actually only the volunteer, but and I've done it many times.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I have.
You good? Oh, good. Okay. Okay, so once you have your earplug open, we'll start with the foam earplug. And so the foam earplug, you will, let me get mine open here. Okay, so you'll roll it between two fingers, and then you're going to reach around to the opposite ear and pull up and back on your pinna. And this, remember, your ear canal is S-shaped, so this is actually helping us straighten our ear canal just a bit. Then you're going to insert your earplug until it's about 2/3 of the way down your ear canal, and then hold it in place until you feel it fully expand. Okay, and once you feel it expanding, there's a couple of ways we can check for a good fit. So the first is just to gently tug on the earplug itself. If you're noticing a little resistance, that's what we're aiming for. A little resistance is good. A lot of resistance where you're able to pull it out easily is bad and you need to reseat. Another way you can check is to take your hands and cover your ear. If you're not hearing much sound difference out of that ear, you know it's also seated pretty well. I'm angling it for me just kind of straight in, but everyone's ear is a little different. You might have to adjust your angle a little bit. Yeah. Anyone else having trouble getting theirs to seat well? Okay. And the other thing we can do is if you all turn to the person near you and see, you shouldn't be able to see too much of the earplug when you're looking at someone that's kind of straight on. So I've got mine like pretty deep in here. If you're feeling like yours is sticking pretty far out, try to squeeze it down a little bit more and reseat a little bit deeper. Okay. Perfect. Once you have it in pretty well, we're going to do the same audio test that we did a moment ago. Skip forward to that page. And I'm going to have you put the other earplug in just a second. But we're going to do the same thing we did before. So eyes closed first, and then once you hear the sound, try to raise your hand. And you should hear it a little bit later this time, remember, because we are having our earplugs in, so we've got some occlusion happening or some attenuation happening. When you're ready, we'll put the other earplug in. This one enters about the same as far as lifting your ear back, but you don't have to squeeze this down a little bit. It's a little bit easier to get in there. And you just want to seat it until it's about 2/3 of the way in. Okay. So everyone, eyes closed when you're ready. Okay. Okay, eyes open. We'll take out the silicone one just because it's a little easier. Did you notice it being harder to hear the sound with the earplugs in? No? For some of us, it should be harder. For some of us, it might not be harder. It just depends. Yeah? Okay, we'll do it one more time. Put your silicone one back in, and this time leave your eyes open. Pretty much everyone's hearing it now? Okay. Yeah, so I had to turn it up a little bit more than on the first one for us all to be able to hear it. So just an interesting observation about how these earplugs work. Go ahead and take your earplugs out. All right, so these are both really good options for musicians if you are exposed to loud sounds. I will talk a little bit more about some of the other options in just a second, but I do want to point out, just generally speaking, some of the limitations that we have to earplugs in general. There we go. Okay, so limitations to earplugs in general that we have. The real ear attenuation test is how all hearing protection is used, or is assessed essentially when it is being created. So this basically uses an audiogram, so that test that we just did to measure a person's typical hearing against their hearing with an earplug in. And then it's assigned a noise reduction rating, so how much or what the difference is between when they had the earplug in versus when they didn't. It will be assigned to this noise reduction rating number. Usually these earplugs that I gave you, I think these are like 30 or 32 dB. These ones were about the same. So you're looking for the noise reduction rating that's going to take your level of risk on your TWA, let's see here, down to a more useful amount. So for us, if we're using an earplug that's 30 noise reduction rating, we can subtract 30-ish from this TWA, and hopefully we'll get underneath 85 dB to be in like a safer zone. Does that sort of make sense for how to use the noise reduction rating on a package of earplugs? Okay, so back to, skip forward again. There we go. Okay, so back to our real ear attenuation test. The main problem with this test is that only about 7 to 9 frequencies are used to test all earplugs, period. And really only 5 of these tones are actually reliable when you compare them to our normal hearing and what the human ear can perceive. This is because the occlusion effect, so when your ears are closed, you're hearing a lot more internal body sounds that are on the low register. So really what we're testing earplugs for, this B2-ish is about the lowest frequency that's super reliable with human hearing that we can hear. And then it also goes up to a couple that are higher off the piano that are not on here. That 4,000 hertz is going to be like somewhere over here that we were just listening to. So what this means is that it's sort of like tuning 5 notes on your piano and then saying, okay, the rest of it's in tune because we checked these 5 notes. So there's some issues with that, right? We would know as musicians. You've also probably seen these high fidelity or musicians earplugs marketed to you. And while any music or any hearing conservationist will always tell you that the best earplug is the one that you're going to wear. So if those are the ones you want to wear, that's great. But just be aware that there's also some evidence that says that using these type of earplugs specifically, just the way that they're designed, has some effects of potentially raising your risk in the low registers because of this here where they're not being tested. So something to be concerned with as musicians. This is something that we really need to advocate more for as musicians to bring them into, to bring this research forward and have this actually be something that we can use, because we deserve to have earplugs that actually work for us. This brings me to just a couple of key takeaways. So noise-induced hearing loss is a concern for people worldwide, but it's preventable with proper knowledge and action. Recommendations for NIOSH and others are not fully developed for music, but they can give us a starting point to sort of jump off with conversations about managing your hearing health. And also, our musical behaviors are the things that are driving the risk for hearing loss in most cases. Monitoring your personal exposure levels or the sound levels in your ensembles can help you start to learn to manage your risks. And while we have a lot to investigate about hearing health related to learning and performing music, these takeaways can start to help you make decisions about preserving your hearing in the long term. So that is all I have. If you have questions, I'd love to hear them. I will just kind of step out into the hallway because I'm just running a little over on time. But if you have feedback for me about this presentation, please feel free to scan the QR code or email me. My email is up here also. But thank you all so much for being here.